In our first two episodes about the life and art of Disney legend Mary Blair, we looked at the lives of Mary and Lee Blair as they developed as young artists. Both had moments of success, with Mary winning contests and Lee receiving a gold medal for his watercolor at the 1932 Los Angeles Olympics. Their initial ideas about art were deeply shaped by art school as well as by their instructors, particularly watercolorist Millard Sheets and illustrator Pruitt Carter. When we left off last time, Lee had taken a job at the iWorks animation studio where he worked as an entry-level in-betweener, something he referred to as prostituting his abilities to make a living. And Mary, still taking an occasional class from Pruitt Carter at night, was working, as Lee described it, as a barmaid at a local theater. Once they were married, though, they both understood that their lives were changing and that they would soon face new challenges. And this is exactly where we pick up our story today. During the early days of their marriage, Lee doted on Mary. In letters, he called her his little lover and sweetheart and darling wife. His letters revealed that he thought of them as a team, somehow unified in both life and art. "Darling mine, I love you," he said, "and think of you a great deal. You and I are going to work together always." In reply, Mary echoed these sentiments. "You are always with me," she wrote Lee. "You are going to help me always in everything I do. Help me to paint and draw and be a success with you, for I adore you and love you." In another note, while visiting her parents, she wrote, "My darling, I see your beauty in everything. I close my eyes and your sweet smile and face linger in my memory until it seems I'm with you." That year was somewhat of a wonder period for the two newlyweds. In the summer, they were asked to show their work together at the Ambassador Hotel, with Lee giving a class on landscape painting. As part of this show, their work was reviewed in the Los Angeles Times. "Lee Blair has in his brush the feeling of a true artist," said art critic Fred Hogue. "Two of his bits of landscape, a corner of a golf link, and a girl in a one-oared boat on the shore of a lake of sleeping water are little gems, and Mary Blair paints plaques that are even more radiant than those of her husband." In the months following their marriage, they lived at 1138 Elm Avenue in Glendale, California, which was close to where Lee had grown up, but many miles from the center of Hollywood animation. The two clearly wanted to live elsewhere in town, but money was a limitation, especially as Lee was still employed as an in-betweener at the iWorks studio. Almost surely to increase their collective income, Mary went to work for iWorks as well, as an opaquer, Lee explained, which would later be called an artist in the ink and paint department. At the iWorks studio, still located in Beverly Hills, Mary spent her time painting cells while Lee spent his time creating drawings to finish scenes started by more senior men. In the early 1930s, most animation studios divided some art jobs by gender. Most artists, though not all in the animation department, were men, and most, though not all in the ink and paint department, were women. The various types of animators, from leads to assistants to in-betweeners, drew character outlines on paper. Artists in the ink and paint department transferred these drawings onto clear cells and then painted them. Each job in this chain required great skill, from arranging movement to precisely applying paint so each image in a scene appeared nearly identical to the one before it. At the iWorks studio, those who transferred the drawings with ink pens were called tracers, and those who typically added black, white, and gray paints were called opaquers. iWorks primarily created black and white cartoons, though as an experiment the studio did at times use colored paint to see if that created stronger gray nuances in the finished print. Mary found the shift from her personal art to animation somewhat difficult. The studio had a release schedule that needed to be met no matter the cost. You get an education in school and in college, she said, and then you start to work, and that's when you learn. At the time, she was making about $15 a week, which required tremendous effort. Still, as a newlywed, she understood the job was necessary. With dual employment, Lee and Mary together made about $35 a week, which was far more than either had previously earned. But Lee felt he could do better. Through friends, he heard about openings and expansions in the local animation industry. Beyond iWorks, there was the Disney studio, the Charles Mintz studio, a relatively new studio attached to Warner Brothers, and of course the Walter Lantz unit where Preston had begun his career, which released their films through Universal. Lee believed that Disney was at the top of the pecking order, but also that Disney had a full shop of artists and tended not to hire from other studios. In June, after in-betweening at iWorks for roughly a year, Lee explored career options in animation, looking for a studio where he could move from being an in-betweener to an assistant animator, ideally with a path toward becoming a lead. He took samples of his work to Leon Schlesinger's studio, who produced the Looney Tunes and Merry Melody series for Warner Brothers. Lee knew that Schlesinger had recently lost its two directors, Hugh Harman and Rudy Eising, as well as artists, which meant that they were searching for new hires. When Lee arrived, portfolio in hand, he found that the animator who did the hiring was on vacation for 2 weeks. Not long after this, he took his samples over to those two directors who had recently parted ways with Schlesinger, Hugh Harman and Rudy Eising, who still had their own studio. Even though they were both in their young 30s, Harman and Eising had a long history in animation. Like iWorks as teenagers, they had started with Walt Disney in Kansas City and later joined his California studio before they set out on their own. Initially, they worked with Looney Tunes. Then, after parting ways with Schlesinger, a separation in which they kept their studio space but Schlesinger kept the cartoon series, they completed contract work for a New York studio, but recently they'd signed a contract to create 14 cartoons for MGM, including a double-length offering planned as a musical spectacular. It would present Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Suite as a 12 to 14-minute cartoon with interesting visuals and a sophisticated orchestral track. This series, called Happy Harmonies, stylistically would follow other music-focused series such as Merry Melodies created by Schlesinger and Silly Symphonies created by Disney, both of which capitalized on the relatively young technology of synchronized sound. The Happy Harmonies series, using money from MGM, would employ a 34-piece symphony orchestra playing arrangements from classical to jazz. As harmonizing staffed up for their first cartoon, they were looking for additional artists. Knowing this, Lee made his way over to the harmonizing office. It was on Hollywood Boulevard over a pharmacy, Lee recalled. Nothing about the second-story office suggested the glitz of MGM or even the minor glitz of a Hollywood animation studio. It looked more like an office that might house an accounting firm. But this was the same studio location where, before parting ways with Schlesinger, Harman and Eising had created some Looney Tunes offerings, only now the space was half empty. Lee showed his samples to Hugh Harman, who was the only manager in the office. Harman agreed that Lee's work was far better than that of an in-betweener, and that with some training he could be something more. At the end of his interview, Harman explained that, pending the approval of his partner Rudy Eising, Lee could start at $35 a week, maybe a bit more, with an understanding that he would work toward becoming a lead animator. The offer seemed good, but as Lee left the studio, he had second thoughts about working there. Like the iWorks studio, the harmonizing studio felt like another startup outfit that may or may not succeed, one that appeared so transitory it was still arranged in rented office space above a pharmacy. The two best connected animation studios in town Lee knew were Schlesinger's, which he'd already visited, and Disney. Thinking over his options, he decided that it would be, well, a lazy attitude to get a job at any other studio than Disney. He called one of his Chenard friends who said that he could at least arrange an interview with one of the Disney directors. The following week, Lee went over to the Disney studio. The Disney studio was located just outside Hollywood in the Silver Lake district. This was a quiet part of town, a slender street surrounded by apartment buildings and foothills. The studio itself was centered around a two-story Spanish Revival building with a terracotta roof, wrought iron railings, and cream-colored adobe walls. Above it all was a large sign featuring Mickey Mouse with his gloved hand raised in greeting that announced Walt Disney Studios, Mickey Mouse and Silly Symphony Sound Cartoons. Lee looked at the studio, which seemed more established and permanent than other animation shops in town. Then he walked in. Again, he talked with artists who were interested in hiring him, but Disney had a recruitment system different than that of other studios. They insisted that they train each new hire in the particular way Disney created animation. Each new hire would attend training classes, start as an in-betweener, work with other in-betweeners, until the time came that an animator accepted them onto their team. I would have to start there at in-betweeners pay on the same salary, Lee said. He believed this to be $25 a week, slightly more than he was making at iWorks, but far less than he was being offered elsewhere. Now that he understood the full range of his prospects, he decided to go with harmonizing, assuming that Rudyizing signed off on his employment. In relating the news to Mary, he explained that this was an opportunity for both of them to focus more on their watercolors and oils, all those serious projects that Lee believed would eventually move them toward real success. The larger paycheck from harmonizing would simply help support their work in the fine arts. You are going to help me enjoy life, Lee wrote Mary, and be the means for both of us to lead a full existence, to be making watercolors and oils of your reactions to life about you, and to be in love at the same time will be the most complete and satisfactory life if we want it to be. With a better paying job, Lee and Mary moved from Glendale to a more fashionable address, near other artists and animators just off Hollywood Boulevard at 1794 Winona Street. From the sidewalk, they could see the hill where the Griffith Observatory was then being built. It was definitely a step up in the world. At about this same time, Mary announced that she would leave iWorks. As Lee explained, Mary didn't want to have anything more to do with animation, so she went home and started painting seriously. The Harmonizing Studio was designed to compete with Warner Brothers and Disney. Their efforts were largely focused on music, so that many 6-minute cartoons were arranged as a near continuous string of song and dance numbers. Unlike live action, animation in the mid-1930s could more effectively manage musical movement on screen, emphasizing the beat and how characters walked, played cards, or even wiggled their whiskers. Animation, more than live action, had the tools to make musical numbers sparkle on screen. Sound was in at the time, Lee explained, so we had happy harmonies to rival Disney's Silly Symphonies and Warner Brothers' Merry Melodies. As an assistant animator, Lee still needed to match character arrangement and line weight of those drawings already completed. To become a lead animator, a person who oversaw and managed a scene, he needed to learn the art of movement gaps between drawings, how to arrange them so that even the most commonplace actions, like a character walking down the street or knocking on someone's door, offered the audience something infused with a small dose of wonder. The lead animator oversaw how movement was spaced and punctuated throughout the entire scene. For many art school animators, the most difficult aspect of the job wasn't the drawings themselves. Most art school trained animators could draw pleasing characters in their sleep. Rather, it was managing action, how to effectively arrange movement gaps between sequential drawings, especially action arranged for dance or comedy. This was the skill they hadn't learned in art school. Film captured movement at 24 frames per second. One of the keys to effective animation was deciding how to space movements between sequential drawings so that action bristled and popped on the screen. To better develop this skill, artists at Harmonizing studied the movement gap of live-action actors on film. What size movement gaps allowed actors to appear comedic or mesmerizing or musical? "We did use Charlie Chaplin a lot," Lee explained. "We'd get old Charlie Chaplin films, and we had a hand-cranked projector. I had it alongside my animation board there at Harmonizing. We'd crank his walks and his pratfalls. We'd study those." In this, Lee wasn't studying Chaplin's gestures or poses. Those were elements he had mastered in life drawing classes. But instead, how much movement there was in his hands, his head, even his cane, between one frame and the next, so the action, when screened in real time, suggested comic movement. The presentation of finished animation was more artful at Harmonizing than it had been at iWorks. Though a few iWorks cartoons were produced in two-strip color, the vast majority of their output was in black and white. At Harmonizing, all of the cartoons were in two-strip color, as the Disney studio, through masterful negotiations, had acquired a temporary exclusive license in animation to use the only reliable process capable of delivering a full-color print by combining 3 strips of color. Until this exclusive arrangement ended in September of 1935, all other animation studios could either present their cartoons in black and white, which had mostly been the case at the iWorks studio, or in two-strip color, which was the case now at Harmonizing. 3-strip color combined film records of red, blue, and green to create a full-color print. For the 2-color strip process, studios needed to pick 2 of the 3 primary tones to create a partially colored print. Harmonizing typically chose red and blue as their 2-color records, which offered a reasonable range of color combinations. But if a color was set in nature, such as was the case with Tales of the Vienna Woods, they shifted to red and green, leaving out colors in the blue spectrum to better present grass and trees. Still, for an audience accustomed to seeing most offerings in black and white, the limited 2-strip process was a revelation, a marvel on the screen, something not yet widely used in live action. Beyond this, the animation quality was better at Harmonizing than it had been at iWorks. The first Happy Harmonies cartoon, set entirely to music called The Discontented Canary, told the story of a caged bird who longs to be free, but after escaping, discovers that the natural world is cold and full of predators. In the end, the bird flies back to the warmth and safety of his house, cage and all. Newspapers called it charming and outstanding. Reviewers understood that MGM, using the Harmonizing studio, was taking aim at far more famous studios across town. The Oakland Tribune said, MGM offers polite opposition to Walt Disney with a color cartoon, The Discontented Canary. More than one newspaper was so confused by the quality, they said in print, that it was a Walt Disney cartoon. Surprisingly, one of the people to make this blunder was Edwin Shallard, a drama and film critic at the Los Angeles Times, an error that must have sent ripples of joy through the harmonizing office, including that table where Lee Blair worked as an assistant animator. Between his new focus on movement and the use of limited color on screen, Lee was now finding animation to be far more interesting than it had been over at iWorks. His focus, though, remained on his fine art. During these same months, Lee and Mary worked on their watercolors and paintings, still with an understanding that animation was merely a means to support themselves. "We were painters," Lee said, "and we were exhibiting, and we had landscape classes that we taught. That was what we wanted to do the most. Animation was a way to live." Lee's work continued to document lives of everyday people. One painting created in 1935 called Forest Home presented families living in beige military-style tents surrounded by tall trees. Again, his composition was largely comprised of darker tones, with people arranged with a few quick brushstrokes and blending into the shadowy background. Mary's work as well continued with darker colors, often presenting a city at night. One painting from roughly this time, called San Francisco Cable Car, depicted a streetcar rising up out of a denim-toned haze to collect evening passengers who waited beside a building, their features concealed in shadow. Mary's art tended to focus more on light and use more washes, but in terms of her overall style, presentation of subjects, and selection of colors, her art was similar to Lee's. In ways, their watercolors were an expression of their marriage, a statement as to how they were joined together both in life and in art. After a few months of being an assistant animator and studying movement, Lee was finally promoted to a lead at Harmonizing, where he now controlled his own scenes, which included the presentation of a character and, more importantly, its movement. Each week, he and his assistant needed to finish about 40 or 50 feet of full animation. The first scene assigned to him was in the 8th Happy Harmony effort called The Lost Chick. The story opens with a mother hen singing a lullaby to her nested eggs while she knits a sweater and gently shifts her unhatched charges back and forth. Through this rocking, one of those eggs slips out of the nest and rolls across the henhouse, out the door, down a wooden ramp, and into the woods. "They gave me the egg rolling scene," Lee explained, "which is one that no one wanted anyway. Who wants to animate an egg rolling?" The entire sequence, one of the longest in the cartoon, lasted roughly 25 seconds, as the egg rolled across the coop and down into a gully before finally finding its resting place. "That was the first animation scene that I did," he added, "and it worked out fine because I used the axis of the egg, and one end was smaller and so forth, and I became an animator." After this point, Lee began to see more possibilities in animation. In part, Happy Harmonies had greatly improved over their first 8 cartoons, both in terms of character design, camera movement, and the incorporation of music. Though it's humorous that a reviewer could have confused their first cartoon, The Discontented Canary, with Disney's Silly Symphony series, The Lost Chick, in terms of presentation quality, could easily be confused with any Disney cartoon from that time. With the elevation in quality at Harmonizing, Lee became more interested in animation, especially now that he controlled his own scenes. And also as a result of the elevated quality, the Disney studio became quietly interested in Lee. Right about the time that The Lost Chick was released, Lee's name was passed around the Disney studio as someone Walt might consider hiring. Disney had just made an offer to Preston Blair, an offer he seems to not have accepted, and artists at Disney believed that Walt should make an offer to Lee. In early March 1935, Disney background artist Mike Nelson sent a note to Walt that Phil Dyke, who partially oversaw training, knew of only one man whom he would recommend without reservation to join Disney, an artist who wasn't constrained by a long-term contract. "Is there any studio agreement standing in the way of Phil trying to interest the fellow?" Nelson asked. "His name is Lee Blair, brother of the animator coming to us from Mintz." The letter does not indicate what role was envisioned for Lee. It's possible that Lee was being considered for animation, but more likely, as most of the people in this discussion were background painters, Lee was being considered for a position to paint with them. Though artists at Disney would later use gouache, a dense water-based medium, to create backgrounds, for their first feature, Snow White, then in production, the studio was planning to use watercolors, a slightly more temperamental and transparent medium. Phil Dyke, a watercolorist himself, knew Lee from the California Scene Movement and from the Watercolor Society, which suggests that this was how he wanted to employ Lee at the studio. There is no indication that the studio followed up on Phil Dyke's suggestion, but with this conversation, Lee Blair was then on Walt's radar as an artist the studio might consider for advanced employment, an artist who could be hired as a trained professional and could easily bypass the apprentice system at Disney. Moreover, Lee was likely on Walt's radar not for his skills as an animator, but rather for watercolors. The following September, the animation industry opened in a new way, one that began to interest Lee even more. For the previous 3 years, Disney had held an exclusive license to use the 3-strip Technicolor process in animation. When the exclusive license expired, Lee found that he was valued in new ways at harmonizing. For years, Lee had focused on how color could create mood in his own paintings, how tones and values focused the viewer's attention and also amplified the emotional terrain of an image. Now, animation studios were starting to ask the same questions. How could color advance from a novelty to a nuanced tool arranged to deepen an audience's enjoyment and appreciation of a cartoon? At Harmonizing, they asked one more question. How could they create a better or more distinguished full-color product than those produced at Disney? For the most part, Harmonizing was filled with artists who specialized in caricature, life drawing, illustration, and movement studies. This was not a question that fell easily into their camp. It was, however, a question that deeply interested Lee. Lee began to create color charts for upcoming cartoons with an eye toward emotional sophistication and originality. "We splashed color all over the screen," Lee explained. "We were using modern-type design, and purples and reds and greens, and over at Disney, they were doing children's book-type stuff, everything brown and black line with color accents on the characters." The first 2 3-strip full-color Harmonizing cartoons, The Old Plantation and Honeyland, were released weeks after Disney's exclusive license expired. With this, animators at Harmonizing felt that they were approaching, perhaps even briefly exceeding, the efforts of other studios. "As a result, we began to outshine Disney," Lee said. Once Harmonizing had mastered the basics of full color, Lee's job at the studio expanded into cartoon planning. "They got really serious about it," Lee said, "so I started making color sketches for Hughes Pictures." Lee worked alongside the layout department. Once a story was finished, the layout department mapped out each scene, defining character movements from one scene to the next. Sitting beside layout artists, Lee brushed out color samples that should be used in each scene to intensify the story's emotions and to better unify the entire cartoon. "Little thumbnail watercolors," Lee said. "I'd do color sketches right along with layout." In this, the two worlds of art that Lee had explored for years, commercial animation and fine arts watercolors, were slowly coming together as the cartoons at Harmonizing moved further away from something related to newspaper comics and leaned ever so slightly toward the visual tones used to create gallery art. As Lee rose in importance at Harmonizing, Mary focused on both her watercolors and commercial designs. One of the most significant accomplishments from this period came once again from a contest. Along with 2,800 other individuals, she entered the May Company's contest for female artists. Her painting of a Victorian hat won first place, along with a prize of $100. Back when she was at Chenard, $100 would have supported her for months, but now it was the equivalent of Lee's salary for 2 weeks. More so than money, however, was the prestige. The prize indicated that her name was continuing to rise in the world of fine arts. Lee, however, was now moving into a place where he had a higher opinion of animation, in part because its quality was improving year by year. "Well, I like this way of making a living better than any other," he said. Likely as a result of Lee's higher salary, the Blairs almost surely tried to start a family. Though neither specifically pinpoint the end of 1935 or the beginning of 1936, there are strong suggestions in letters and in one interview that this was the period when they first tried to start a family. Children, Lee later said, they were late in coming. These attempts to conceive did not go well, with one pregnancy almost surely ending in a miscarriage. Again, though the word miscarriage is not used in their correspondence, the suggestion of a miscarriage moves through multiple letters in the spring of 1936. In either April or May, Mary went home to spend significant time with her family, to recover and recuperate while Lee remained in Los Angeles. "Darling," Lee wrote in one letter, "please do rest all of the time. I'm convinced that will set you on your feet again. I miss you certainly, but everything has its time and place." This situation seems to have spurred Lee to reconsider his place in and his income from studio animation. When Lee talked about his work in this same set of letters, his tone was more optimistic, more forward-looking. "The work I'm doing now at the studio is a chance of a lifetime," he told Mary, "to really accomplish something." He also started to believe that animation might be a way to spend more time with his brother Preston, with the two of them working at the same studio. "Prez is going to help me," Lee said. "He may move over to Harmonizing. He saw Hugh Harmon today." But that move seems to have never happened, with Preston remaining, at least for now, at the Charles Mintz studio drawing Crazy Cat. When Mary returned from her parents, she focused again on her painting. As if to compensate for the loss in her personal life, the art world sent her another round of accolades. That summer, she exhibited her work at the Texas Centennial. The Texas Centennial, much like a World's Fair, ran for 5.5 months with a midway, corporate exhibits, and cultural pavilions. Mary's work was presented in the Hall of the Fine Arts, which later became the permanent home for the Dallas Museum of Art. In nearby halls were works by Edward Manet, Auguste Renoir, and Pablo Picasso. In all, 96 museums loaned work to create the exhibit, along with work from a handful of living American artists. Mary would be one of only 4 California artists featured at this event. That summer, as a first-place winner in the 1932 Olympics, Lee, too, received an invitation to exhibit his work in another Olympic arts competition, this time in Berlin. But as the invitation held a German swastika and was signed by one of Hitler's top men, Joseph Goebbels, very wisely, Lee declined to participate. Now, a few years out of grad school, both Lee and Mary noticed that the siren song of the fine arts was beginning to fade. The fine arts, they knew, wouldn't support them. Beyond this, it was one thing to focus on contests and gallery shows when surrounded by classmates who vied for the same awards. But it was another thing when those classmates and the bristling sense of competition were no longer around them. It was possible that their internal motors, tightly wound during classes with Millard Sheets and Pruitt Carter, would propel them in this direction for a couple of years after graduation, but it was less likely that memories, no matter how strong, of art school and the shadow competition one might take from it would guide them all the way through life. Quite simply, the remembered voices of art school friends were now growing quiet, replaced by other demands that concerned money, family, and happiness. Lee was still focused on success, particularly a type of success that others would recognize. His concept of success would almost always include the fine arts, but he was now starting to accept that success might come from a related or adjacent field. Mary, too, was at the point where she was starting to look beyond art school for new ways to express herself. She was also looking for a new community of colleagues and friends, especially as the life she and Lee were making for themselves was hundreds of miles from her home. I'll be back next week to continue our story about Disney legend Mary Blair. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.